If I don't know your story, I don't know you. I can't make assumptions based on your passport. I can't make assumptions based on your race. I can't make it based on your ethnicity. I need to hear your story. We need to rethink the boxes we put people in. And we also need to pay attention to story and find those places of connection.
Welcome to Language and Culture with Dr. J. My guest today is Ruth van Reken, whose work with third culture kids has shaped my views on the topic and has guided my own research. She is the co-author of the ultimate reference book on third culture kids. It is entitled Third Culture Kids Growing Up Among Worlds. Ruth van Reken is also the author of Letters Never Sent, which is a personal journal that seeks to understand the long-term impact of her cross-cultural childhood. Ruth was born in Nigeria, has lived in the US, Liberia, Kenya, and currently lives in Indianapolis, Indiana, with her husband, David. For more than 30 years, Ruth has traveled extensively in order to talk to people about issues related to the impact of global mobility. As part of her work, she co-founded and for a time chaired the organization Families in Global Transition. It is such an honor to have you on the podcast. Welcome, Ruth van Reken.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'm always grateful for any opportunity to encourage others in this journey and to help normalize it for those who maybe sometimes wonder what's the matter with me because I don't think and act like other people around me. So thanks for having me.
Your generation opened the doors and began exploring third culture kids. What are some of the most significant discoveries and milestones of this phase one, as you call it, of TCK research and work?
When you look back, it's interesting to me that there were glimmers of people saying there's something different about kids who are raised outside of their parents' culture. In the 1930s already, the principal of Woodstock School in India did his master's degree on those students. He didn't call them third culture kids. He just kind of noted there were characteristics that were kind of different. The term third culture kid came when Dr. Ruth Useem, who was a sociologist at Michigan State, went to India with her husband, who was an anthropologist, because they wanted to study how did people from two cultures do business together when they had different ways and different habits and so forth. So they took a year sabbatical. They went to India in the mid-50s, but Dr. Ruth Useem became much more interested in the children of the Americans they were studied, and then it spread to the other communities of expats that were there. And there was something different about these kids than her students back in Michigan State. In some ways, they were older than their age. They had a worldview. They had, awareness of things that the kids in Michigan State didn't. In other ways, they were sort of immature. They didn't know all the social skills of their home country and so forth, which would have been the States or wherever they came from. She also noticed that the expats shared something in common, even when they were from different countries and different sectors, whether they were military, missionary, foreign service, or business. And so she called the kids who were from that community third culture kids because their parents had been named men of the third culture in those days. But Dr. David Pollock, so then in the 1970s, went to Kenya and he began to work in an international school, and he noticed the same thing and picked up Dr. Useem's term and began to develop what he called the third culture kid profile. What were these characteristics? What were the benefits he was seeing? What were the challenges? And so that's how it began originally. And although I grew up in this environment, I never knew there was a name for me until I was 39. And my mother sent me an article by Dave Pollock, and that was the first time I heard of the term. So I was 39. It was 1984. We had lived in Liberia almost 9 years, but there were many changes happening. My husband had been working at the government hospital and at the medical school there, and both had closed because of the political situation at that time. So we were kind of trying to figure out what we were going to do. And it seemed like maybe we should at least come home for a little bit and kind of regroup. And because of that, my daughter was going to start high school, and her grandma said, why don't you come back to the States, start school so you don't have to change school in a year? And, you can stay with me these months and that'll all be fine. Well, I had lived with my grandmother for high school. My parents went back to Nigeria when I was 14. I didn't see them until I was 18. That's how it was in those days, phase one. And so it made sense for different reasons. But I had this enormous reaction. And I'd had a place in my life that for all the good things of my life that I loved and everything, seemed so positive and I loved my life, there was this silent place of depression that most people wouldn't see. When my daughter decided that she would like to accept her grandma's invitation and leave us in Liberia for a few months before we came back, it made intellectual sense, but I had a major emotional reaction and I couldn't figure it out. So at some point I thought, whatever this thing is, has hit me so many times. What is it? I have learned in my life that when I have a reaction that's out of proportion to whatever's going on, it's telling me something that I probably don't have words for yet. So I thought, all right, my daughter's leaving. I left for boarding school at 6 years old. Are they connected? Is this reaction to her leaving something to do with my leaving? So the only thing I could figure out, there's no counselors in Liberia. And I don't think at that point there's any that would have had any idea what to do because this was all kind of a hidden topic then. So I decided to start writing letters to my parents as if I was the 6-year-old in boarding school. And that's what became letters eventually, but I wasn't writing a book. I was just trying to understand my story. The minute I started to write about being 6 and them turning out the lights, I just could feel everything in my body that I had felt as a 6-year-old. But now I had an adult me who could write down what I was feeling. And in doing the journaling is when I began to realize how much unresolved grief I had because my life had been so good and I loved so much about it. So how could I be sad? And I think I didn't realize what a paradoxical experience this was. When I started to journal about leaving Nigeria for the first time, I realized that was when my world died because everything I knew, my friends, my trees that I climbed, my market, my smells, the smell of harmattan at Christmas, and all these things were gone. But we had no funeral because nobody died. And so it was those kind of things that I had come to find I had to look at and grieve. And that was how I got into the topic and met Dave. And then also I need to acknowledge Norma McCabe was a business kid who had grown up in India and the Philippines as well. And she started the Global Nomad chapters about that same time. She didn't like being called a kid. So she started Global Nomads. We had the first Global Nomad conference in 1988 because she said this is more than any one sector. And so she kind of was the person with that vision that we could have conferences that mixed and matched the sectors, which is what we did later with families and global transition. So that's how it started. And one day I was talking to Dave Pollock. He was the one going around the world and trying to get people to believe this. And nobody believed it for a long time. But I saw something in Wall Street Journal quoting him, and I'd seen something in the New York Times. And I said, Dave, you've got to write your stuff up because you're going to quote the people quoting you if you don't do that. And he said, well, I don't have time. So I heard myself say, well, I'll help you. I thought, how hard can it be? He's got all this material. But then when we sent in a proposal to Intercultural Press, because nobody else would even look at it, they said it's not that big a topic. Then that editor said, oh, you can't just describe, the characteristics. You have to explain why they happen. I thought, oh, man. So that was 7 more years of thinking and talking and having a good time exploring. And that's how the book came.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. I did not know all the background to it. Thank you. May I interject a couple observations? I mean, you actually reduced me to tears here. I was very much touched by your wording when you said, when my parents left to Nigeria when I was 14 years old, my world died. And we didn't have a funeral because nobody died. And this is so interesting to hear from you because before we started the podcast interview, you asked me how I got started and why I got started. And I told you my whole story of how the podcast came about. I told you about my cancer and how all that affected it. But I didn't tell you about the part of my father's immigration affecting it. I mean, this search for identity has been something that I've struggled with significantly. When you describe this, you lost the trees that you climbed. Those are things that I have also mourned. The park that I loved. There's so many images that were conjured up by your sentence. And this is something that I tried to do in writing. I don't know if you're aware of it. I published a book called Life with Coach Pop. It takes my writings from when I was 12. So when my father defected, my mother and I couldn't join him for 2.5 years. And then we did manage to immigrate to the US and lived in Texas. And as a little present to my first private school, where the teachers welcomed me and the students really welcomed me, as a small non-denominational Christian private school, St. Michael's Academy, whose headmaster and headmistress, Mr. and Mrs. Spencer, were an integral part of my finding home in the US. And I wanted to write a little book in honor of the school, and it ended up being an 80-page novella that kind of traces my father's defection and then the struggles that my mother and I went through all the way to kind of finding home in Texas at this school. And I wanted to do something with that. The teachers who read the little novella really supported it and found it very interesting and well written, especially for a 12-year-old immigrant child who could barely speak English. And they really encouraged my parents to try to get this manuscript published. And as you can imagine, my parents were struggling to survive and to just make ends meet. So the book just kind of went on a back shelf and no one gave it much thought. And it's after this whole crisis with my cancer, I felt I owed it to this little girl, this little 12-year-old. And I have tears in my eyes as I say this. This little 12-year-old who dared to put herself out there and write something in English and have her best friend, my new best friend in the US, my first friend in the US, was my editor, right? She read it and tried to correct it as best as she could. And I wanted to honor this little girl and her little views. And I thought, how do I publish this as something substantial, as something that's more than just a kid's book? And so what I did was I took every single chapter in this little novella that I wrote when I was 12, and I reacted to it as an adult woman. So it's an interesting dialogue between my adult self and my 12-year-old self. It's an interesting dialogue between myself and my father. My mother-in-law came to live with us for a couple months and took over taking care of the kids and cooking and cleaning and all the organizational stuff so that I could use any free time to write this book. I spent hours crying while I was writing it, but it was my coming to terms with my father's decision to defect. It was his decision to defect. It was his political move, his search for his own identity, his search for his own happiness, but it had nothing to do with me. And reconciling the anger that I felt with him, but at the same time, recognizing the opportunities that he enabled for me. So this is really, I think, so significant, and it really resonates with me.
It sounds like we had a very similar process.
Absolutely.
Because when I was writing the journaling that became Letters Never Sent, as I said, I wasn't writing a book, but the tears that came that I didn't know were in me. But when these things happen to us, like when I'm a 6-year-old and the lights are out, my mommy's not there, all I can do is try not to cry. I don't want to be a crybaby. You're trying to be brave. You're waiting until the lights are out so you can cry in silence. But those tears are stored someplace. And what shocked me when I was doing my writing, and it sounds like for you the same, when you revisit it, it's not too late to grieve.
Yeah.
And the anger, you talk about the anger, anger is and depression are part of grief.
When you were answering the very first question, you said when you and your husband were thinking about maybe taking a break and going home and reconnecting for a while. And that's something that you also talk about, this home culture and your host culture. And that's an aspect of, for example, my identity that I always find so complicated because I don't feel like I have a home culture anymore. So a lot of times I struggle with that, with what do we do with third culture kids who no longer can return home, right? So even though you moved around quite a bit, you always had this US tie. Your husband is American. You had this connection to US culture. So you have a very well-defined home culture. I'm less multicultural than some. Both of my parents are Hungarians from Romania, and they moved to the US. They continue to be together, but I don't have a home culture anymore because I guess my home culture would be Transylvania. There you already have the problem of there is no such country, if you will, as Transylvania. There is Hungary and there's Romania. So there's the first divide already. Then there's the US, where I very much feel at home in Kansas, but I haven't lived there for many years. I don't have a well-defined home culture where I could return. And that said, host culture, I wouldn't want to identify Germany anymore as a host culture because I feel it has become too much my home culture already. So, but not just as related to me, but how would you answer this question of when the division or the definition of home and host culture is no longer so clear?
Well, you make a point that probably 90% of TCKs struggle with at some level. That's why usually I talk about your passport culture, but when I was talking about the idea of the third culture, that people came from their home culture to a host culture, and then they formed this space in between. I resonate with everything you say. When I grew up in Nigeria, I assumed America was quote unquote home because my mother, who grew up in Chicago in one house, always talked about going home. And that's why I think many times reentry is so difficult because you've assumed it's your home somehow. I mean, I knew I wasn't Nigerian. I loved Nigeria. I had great friends in Nigeria, but, I knew it wasn't quote unquote my country. It wasn't my passport country. But when I got back at 13 and I went to school, it was pre-integration. All the kids looked like me. I hadn't a clue what was going on. So all of a sudden, this person who's always thought she was US American doesn't fit in. So that certainly was a huge issue. I had no idea that anybody else, they call it reentry, but that I was not alone. All I knew was what's the matter with me. I can't figure anything out. So that was for high school. Then that's one reason I put the curtain down and didn't tell anybody I'd ever been in Africa because I was trying so hard to be like everybody else. But, inside I knew I didn't fit. And you're right. Nigeria is not my home culture, though I feel terribly at home there. Or I did. My grandmother's house was always a grounding place because we always went back to her house when we came to the States. But I think a few years ago, somebody asked me to do a talk on where is home. I thought, oh, good grief, here we are. And I thought it's okay to have a sense of many homes. I feel at home now in Indianapolis, although I wouldn't say this is where I'm from. The harder question is where you're from. I mean, now I just say I live in Indianapolis, who cares? But I realized when I get off the plane in Africa, I feel at home. People are carrying their babies on their back. They've got things on their head. Everything feels so familiar and so right. But at the same time, I can even feel that way in other countries because I think, especially when I am in the international environment where there's the many diversities and the many ethnicities and differences, that gives me a sense of I know this world. I like this world. I think this world is interesting. So I feel at home there. But I also feel at home in Chicago because that's where I did my high school. And so I decided it was okay to have many kinds of home where I feel at home for different reasons. And I didn't have to just pick one. I don't know if that works for somebody else, but that's where my conclusion came.
It does. And actually, the book that I mentioned, that's how I end it, that I feel that I have four bases and I imagine this tree that has these 4 points where it is rooted. And so it can kind of grow and incorporate all 4 cultures. And by that, I mean the Carpathian Basin is what I will call it, Hungary, Romania, Kansas City and Texas. So the US and then France and of course, Germany. So I absolutely relate to that.
I'm going to have to get your book. Sounds like we're twin sisters with different details. But so, if I may say something,
please.
Your story is representative of the next phase of TCKs, if I may say that.
Please, and that's my next question as well.
So the first cohort that was studied were primarily people who were from Western cultures who had English, as a baseline. But now there are so many people who are growing up cross-culturally for all sorts of reasons. And so the cultural complexity has really changed. And that's why a few years ago, I tried to make a little broader term called cross-cultural kids. And being a TCK is one of them. But if you make the circles, you can have refugees, you can have immigrants, you can have parents who are from two cultures, you can have mixed race, you can have what I call educational CCKs, people who go to school, or many minorities go to school in a different culture than their home. And the list goes on and on. And so many people are in more than one circle now.
Mm-hmm.
I was kind of in the TCK circle, and so I was a minority when I grew up, but I was a privileged minority. So I was basically in barely two circles.
Mm-hmm.
But the first time I used that model, an Indian woman from the audience came up. She said, "Can you be in more than one circle?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, I'm Indian, my husband's Indian, but we're from two different cultures and language groups in India. So right off the bat, we're bicultural marriage. Then we moved to different places in India. So our children are what I would call a domestic third culture kid, that you can have this multicultural experience, cross-cultural experience without leaving the country." She said, "So that's two circles." Then we immigrated to the States. So now they're children of immigrants. We became minorities there. Okay, that's the fourth circle. Then my husband got an international job, so we went wherever they went. So now they're traditional TCKs, but every place we've gone, she said, their school culture is not what we have at home. So she was in 6 circles before she even started. So how does that kind of complexity play out now? And we have a world that's still trying to do diversity training in the model of what life was, and they kind of miss the hidden diversity, the story under the story, because they're making assumptions based on old patterns. So that's what I call TCK phase 2. We're just beginning to look at a whole new dimension of how do we put this complexity, and what does that do, and what does that add to the story. And so at a conference in October, I passed the baton to the next generation. I said, "It's your job now to try and figure out what's the story and how complex it is."
Mm-hmm. So TCKs and CCKs have grown in numbers over the past 2 or 3 decades, and the world has never seen the type of cultural mixing and matching that we are now experiencing all over the globe. Multiculturalism, pluriculturalism, cross-culture kids, global nomads, and third culture kids. All these terms are starting to represent the new norm in society. How do we deal with the loss and dilution of culture that this brings about? And at the same time, how do we work towards enriching a global world with our stories and mixes of cultural backgrounds? How do we reconcile the loss of culture that comes with being multicultural? And how do we still enrich the world with these cultures?
Well, it's, as we used to say in our days, the $64,000 question, because there was a TV program where they would ask a question and you got $64,000 if you answered. But that's a cultural reference that I realized today's generation wouldn't know. It really is the question, because my assumption when I'm looking at the world, when I started in this 40 years ago now, I assumed that as people began to relate across cultures, and to me, the gift of my childhood is knowing people from all these different cultures. I mean, it's such a gift. It's so rich. It made my life so interesting, and got to eat all kinds of food. And, it's just, I loved it. So that was my assumption, that, okay, we just need to get people to figure this out. But I see what's happened is people are terrified. People who grew up more traditionally, and some people who, I'm not going to say grew up globally. I mean, it's, we're no stellar group above everybody else. But there's a fear that has come in because we haven't learned how to rename, or how to put a new paradigm in place. And so a lot of the models of DEI and everything are still kind of based, at least up until a few years ago, on, okay, that's this group and this group. And when they start with difference, it winds up dividing more. And if we could start with what I call likeness, where is that place of shared humanity, then I don't have to be afraid of your difference. If I think of somebody else as they want a relationship, that's why they bow instead of shake hands, but we're all trying to figure out a relationship and things. But at least in my country, the polarization that's happening is unbelievable. It's this new fear of the them, because as these things are shifting and people are losing the markers they've always had for what defines me, what defines my country, the only thing people can do is defined by us and them. I'm not them, so you stay away. So I think it's really important for those of us who've lived in these cross-cultural, all mixed up lives to find out what is this essence that gives us, when we're together, that gives us such a sense of community. At Families in Global Transition, we picked up a phrase that Dave Pollock and Norma McKay used for their conference, a reunion of strangers. Somehow you come together, you have a shared experience. You don't have the traditional sharedness of what ethnicity you are or what nationality or whatever, but we have a shared experience that connects us because it connects us on the emotional level. And, that's where the likeness comes. We all know we need a sense of identity, and we've struggled with that. So how to get that conversation for those who all they know is terror, that, wait a minute, I've lost the definitions of who I am. I think one of the things that's also made a struggle in the world is we haven't always looked at hidden diversity. Dr. Gary Weaver was the head of the Intercultural Institute at American University, and he talked years ago about the cultural iceberg. And he said, we've always made assumptions about people by what we see. If they wear a certain kind of dress, that's whoever they are. If you have a sports team and they've all got red on, they would be together. The problem is that the deeper levels of culture, which is what we don't see, is where like the iceberg conflicts there. And so when we make our assumptions by what we see, and people made their assumptions about me when I came back at 13, that I would have the same cultural awareness that they did of, Elvis and who the singers were and how to swim and how to ice skate and all that. So when I didn't know it, they thought I was stupid, but they didn't understand that my life had been shaped in a way that didn't include those things, because by appearance, I looked like them. And so I think the real work is trying to find maybe bigger models of identity, and also how is it that we understand each other. And I know one encouraging thing is I hear a lot more about story now. If I don't know your story, I don't know you. I can't make assumptions based on your passport. I can't make assumptions anymore based just on your race. I can't make it based on your ethnicity. I need to hear your story, because you've been shaped in a particular way. And that's why I say we start with likeness, that we're humans, and we each need relationship. We each have feelings. We each think. We each, have a creative part. And that gets shaped by our culture and our personalities. But I don't need to be afraid of you when you do it a little different, because there's something in there that I can go back to in our humanity and our likeness and hear your story. And you and I have been talking today about the commonness of our story and yet the uniqueness, right? So there's the likeness and there's the uniqueness. And yet in all those spaces in between, we could connect. So I think that is one of the things we need to rethink, the boxes we put people in. And we also need to pay attention to story and find those places of connection that are there in every story. Every human story has places of connection when you get down to how we feel and our needs. But I don't know how to do that. And I'm 78, so the next generation is going to have to work hard.
I completely understand what you're saying and agree. I see a problem on a practical level, and I love to use the example of Christmas. How do you celebrate Christmas? And my husband is Christian, I'm Christian, so we already don't have this divide of religion. So it shouldn't be such a difficult decision to make. At the same time, it is. I grew up with the angel bringing the presents. In Romania, it is the angel who brings the presents and the Christmas tree on Christmas Eve. In the US, it's, of course, Santa Claus. In Germany, interestingly, it's the Christkind, it's baby Jesus who brings the presents, more from where my husband is from in the Dortmund area. And here in northern Germany, it is Saint Nikolaus. It is more of the Santa Claus tradition. So these, I think, are the questions that are really difficult to answer when you are multicultural. What traditions do you stay true to? And what we ended up doing for our children, because I didn't want them to miss out on anything, we ended up having everything come. So we had a Santa Claus who came, and we had elves who were dressed up and came. We had the angel come, and baby Jesus came as well. That was our decision. That was our solution. But I have to say that it's a heavy solution. It is a bit of a burden. It loses this ease, this.
Yes, and that's the issue with the world. It's lost its ease. That's a great phrase. It's lost its ease of what it means to be something. But if we understand what's going on, in some ways, you have all of the above. It may not be as easy, but one thing you've done by doing that is you've created a family tradition that your children will never forget. Because one of the things I talk about, with identity and stuff, it's incredibly important for parents to have portable traditions if you're going to live this. Because what is it that we do as a family that no matter where we are, that's how we do it? And so part of the uniqueness or part of the joy is adapting some of the things maybe that we used to do someplace else, but still doing that or some form of it, but also maybe doing the both and. I think a lot of families do the both and. And, if you're living in another country, you can pick up something that, or, is done there, or some carving or something that is part of that. And you take that with you the next place, and you're kind of carrying your life with you sometimes, but you're also carrying your history. And in what you're doing, I think it's beautiful because you're sort of celebrating all of your roots. It may be complicated, but I think it's rather beautiful.
When you started talking about TCK and how TCK research started, you related it first to business and to understanding it on this level. Let's go back to that just briefly. If we do all these different traditions, if we incorporate all these different cultures, and we have what you call portable traditions as well, then smaller groups will have different ways of celebrating, different ways of expressing love, different ways of expressing anger, etc. So how do we relate this to the public sphere, to the business sphere? And if I may sort of already suggest my idea of it is, we have to go back to this idea of what you called shared humanity, of actually being interested in the person. I just recently read Aaron Meyer's Culture Map, and I find it really interesting, but I find that it doesn't relate anymore. It no longer gives advice that is pertinent, because we cannot define people through their passport countries,
Exactly.
through their place of birth. We can no longer speak of Germans and these or Americans or Afghanis or these strict national descriptors. There is a lot more fluidity. And so I think that's the challenge of our generation, is to develop a sense of knowledge, a sense of looking at each other beyond these external factors, beyond these clues that we have been taught to look at, but to actually reach each other on a human level and communicate that way. Then it doesn't matter where you are from, what race you are, what religion you are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We then engage in this story, in each other's stories, and find a way of working together, living together, and creating new stories together.
I couldn't agree more. I talked to somebody once years ago, and she used to teach between two groups of people that traditionally did not get together. She was kind of at a border place. She said, feelings are the universal language. If we can have kids write about, like, the fear of the bully. She said, everybody's afraid of a bully. I don't care where you're from. Or why I like to go to my grandma's house. Kids all over the world like to go to grandma's house, right? And she said, if we have these conversations on what we share in the feeling level, she said, we start to look at each other and begin to, oh, that's a real person. It's not just, a name. It's not just a ethnicity or something. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's why it is important to know the stories. And as we listen to them, even if it's not my story, there's a place my emotions connect if somebody else had loss, if somebody else had joy.
Mm-hmm. May I share something that I recently started? It's a little research project that I started. I wanted to find a way to address some of these issues, some of these differences, some of these polarizing topics with especially young people, but also with adults. And I kept running into even more division and even more controversy and even more national stereotypes and even more issues and things that were too political. So I created a fictitious universe. I call it Big Lake Lands. And it's these lands with a big lake in the middle. And I came up with, I used Gerd Hofstede to come up with the cultural dimensions that I wanted to address. And I created different situations that are completely abstract and no longer from real life. So, for example, one issue that is talked about is tomatoes and how we eat tomatoes. And in one land, the tomatoes are peeled and only the flesh of the tomatoes is eaten. In the other land, only the skin of the tomatoes is consumed. In the third land, tomatoes are only given to animals, etc. And so I ask questions and I use some of your studies and this idea of home culture and host culture in the answers. I created 4 different characters who have different cultural backgrounds. There is a monocultural character. There are 2 bicultural characters. One that I would call more from an immigrant background, from migrational background, and one that I call the exchange student, someone who has chosen to live in different countries. And then I have a multicultural character. And I ask different questions about these 4 fictitious characters. But like I said, the topics that I ask about are things like this, like tomatoes. And how would these characters act in given situations? For example, the tomato scenario, how does someone who grows up only eating the flesh of tomatoes deal with being served the skin of tomatoes, and so on? So I've been conducting all these surveys, and these questionnaires have been filled out now at several different schools and universities. And that's something that I think maybe we need more of, these types of incentives, these types of tools that would allow us to speak about some of these fears, some of these resentments, some of these developments by not specifically speaking about it on a national or political level.
I think that's a great idea because we need to think about, is it really a moral issue? Or is it just a preference? A lot of times culture winds up feeling like it's wrong if you only eat the skins because you're supposed to eat the flesh, type thing. But that does bring up another question that I think is important is, what is it that I value no matter which culture I'm in? Because we're kind of living in a world that says, oh, everything's okay. But I have someone else who teaches medical ethics, and he calls it the myth of moral neutrality. And I think the exercise you're talking about is there's an awful lot of stuff that have nothing to do with morality. So could we make a bigger framework that's more inclusive and see what is it that we're sharing? Because anything can become an exclusive club if we're only defining it by, in a way, the externals, even the externals of experience. It is true, we'll relate to people that share more with us. But we can relate to people of vastly different cultures once we think about that shared humanity and so forth.
Ruth, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And do you have any last remarks?
Well, thank you for having me. This always makes me think about life, which is interesting. I believe we are at an important part of history because there's a sea change going on, like you mentioned before, where we've never lived in this kind of a cross-cultural mixing and matching like we're doing now for those of us who have experienced it personally, I believe we're not just spectators in the stand, but we have something to offer. We're kind of the players in the field. And I think sometimes people think, well, who am I to do anything? I mean, years ago, when I started beginning to think about this, I thought, well, somebody's got to figure this out. Who am I? I'm sitting here in Liberia. I'm just me. And that's true. I'm just me. But all the just me's are the people who together can think. And what you're doing with your podcast is your step, spreading the word, seeing what you can do. And for everybody listening, there's one thing you can do. Maybe it's your neighbor you can invite over. I've had people say, well, I don't invite my neighbor over because they're from a different country. I don't want to offend them. I thought, you know how lonely they probably are? Because nobody's inviting them. Could you invite them? Hear their story? Listen to them? Make that one step closer to being human with them? And it's really, really important that each person would do that one next thing. And then I think we would see the growth happening and the connection, because the way it is now, before people hear the story, they already make their judgments. And that's isolating us worse. But if we can think about the likeness of being human and that we're in a new day, that we have to hear stories to find that humanity and that sharedness rather than looking at the externals, then I think we have hope. And people who've lived that and know that already are the ones maybe who could teach others. That's what would be my hope.
Ruth van Reken, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Just a quick note, this is the last episode I am bringing out this year. I'm taking a brief hiatus to gather creative energy, to write 2 books that I have been meaning to bring out, and to rethink and restructure the podcast a bit. But I will be back with new episodes sometime in the spring or summer of 2025. Thank you again for listening. This is Dr. J, signing out.